try to keep our discussion structured around four different themes as we were talking about. So we're going to talk about what does define mean, open versus closed, how do you define it? Ethics and responsibility is going to be another theme. Innovation, and the last but not the least is security and privacy. Those are going to be our four themes, and we're going to hear from our panelists what they think about it. Let me start with the panelists here. What is the key difference in terms of philosophy, development, application? How do you define open versus closed? Should I choose an open model versus closed one? How does business interest influence that decision? So walk me through creating that bounding box around open versus closed. Rory.
Man, I know you told me to keep it at 30 to 45 seconds. It's going to be tough. It's such a complicated question because it's not just about the LLM. It's about risk mitigation for most organizations when they make the decision. And risk mitigation means who is responsible and who are you going to sue. So when it comes to who's responsible for what, that becomes a defining characteristic about whether to be open or closed. Because if you're using a fully managed LLM, then you have a shared responsibility model with whoever the provider is. Whereas open source, you assume a lot more risk. And then going beyond just the LLM, what we're finding is a lot of folks are having to make the decision of where to put the risk, whether it's right at the application tier, how the LLM is managed, and whether or not you're licensing like third-party LLMs or if you're using open source. I do most of my work at the application tier, where it's the least amount of risk, and you're leveraging generative AI in order to make a tastier sausage, not necessarily manage every element of what goes into the sausage. And at that layer, that's what a lot of folks are using to get started, instead of going into the deep end of the pool where they have all of the risk all of the time.
Well, I have clearly voted with my feet, which is, 7 years ago, deciding to join Meta because it was the only company at the time willing to put so much resources behind open research. Now I'm at a different point in the chain, as you mentioned, and I do think this distinction matters a lot. I'm really very early on in the fundamental research. We've been doing open research for a decade now. And what's been wonderful about that is the ability to do a lot of that with much less scrutiny, through which we learned a lot of how to do this. I will say, when we think about the research, there's a couple things that come into play. First of all, fully acknowledging there's a wide spectrum of what open means, and in many ways, a lot of the work that we do, for example, releasing open weight models, doesn't really meet the definitions of the purist of the open source movement. And I think it's important to have precise definitions so people know what are their expectations when they take something. But I also think it's good to have diverse releases that meet different levels rather than only have the one that meets sort of the most demanding definition, if I will. Most of the time when we think about the work, we start every project with the intent to share it openly. That's the base. And when we do that, it sets a really high bar in terms of quality and responsibility. And countless number of times, this has pushed our teams to go above and beyond because we know the books will be open for people to poke in. Once in a while, we have a release that just goes badly. Galactica, if anyone remembers that. This was before anyone had heard about hallucinations being a problem with LLMs. We knew about the hallucination problem. We were releasing a research model. We didn't expect such an uproar. It was a good wake-up call in terms of people having a high expectation of what these models could do and how to position that and how to frame the risk of the release. This was a few months before ChatGPT release. 3 months later, hallucinations is like not an issue. Everyone's worried about other categories of risk. So the other thing we've learned over the years is to have a pretty good taxonomy of risk. What are the different risk vectors? Have very precise way to measure those risks. When possible, building mitigations. This is an evolving process. So with each release, the taxonomy of risks, how we measure them, and the potential mitigations evolve. So we build up the muscle over time. And I will say more than once we've decided not to release something. We started the project with the intent to, we did not release it because we felt there were some risks that were not properly mitigated. One of these examples is a system that was able to do generation of voices with a very high level of fidelity, which incurred a very high risk of voice cloning. And so we decided, not to release that model until we had proper authentication method, watermarking or others on that model.
Worth mentioning is, so I've been an AI engineer, whatever the term is now, but an ML engineer. First started at Uber and then went on to obviously Founderize. I think there's a general, in the AI space, a general push towards open source. I mean, I don't know if it's because TensorFlow, PyTorch, sklearn, like all these tools that even before the Gen AI space, there's always an inclination towards using open source first before trying anything else. And the interesting thing we're seeing actually on the enterprise side with what companies are actually picking now for their applications is actually, if I'm honest, they're kind of going with the kind of closed source models that are tied to the cloud providers that they pick. So if they're a Azure shop, they end up going with Azure OpenAI. If they're a Google shop, they end up going with, we see them leaning towards Gemini. If they're, and with of course the base being the OpenAI is kind of that. I think startups kind of lean more towards that side. In the last year, with Mistral AI and Llama 7B and all of these other open source coming out, I think we've seen that they're not the quick plug and play to actually get an application into production. And that's, I think, been the biggest gap, is that if you want to get something out into production, what we've seen people do is first start off with a closed source option. You get all the APIs, you get all the ease of use immediately, and then, to be honest, they really start to think about open source when it comes to cost and performance. That's what we've seen as like the biggest difference. And it depends on things like, are they going to use the open source model for the actual application, or are they using it for evaluation?
What's so exciting, batting cleanup on this one, is how all the themes you heard from Arun at the beginning about innovation, safety and security, self-management, and frankly, as I'm sure most of the people who came to this talk know, the largest public monument to open source software used to be about 2 blocks that way, back when Mozilla was over there. And so, what's interesting is the old closed versus open dichotomy, as you've already heard, has completely changed. I completely agree, obviously, that the purest form is still the purest form. The difference, of course, is where this matters. And so, even though Inflection is very focused on the enterprise, I'd love to sort of pop the stack for a second and say, part of what's different is even your example, Joelle, about internally deciding not to release out of a sense of responsibility. And so governance questions, like all the great work that ML Commons is doing, the way, as Aparna mentioned, the market, as that aspect of civil society pushes the innovation arc. And as Rory was saying, the risk calculus for enterprises about, well, what can I do, dovetails with flexibility in a way never before, because the data and the language inputs, never mind the outputs, we've never seen this before. Think about the Mongo example, right? You're open sourcing code, but you're still keeping things that today you might consider the model weights safe, precisely because I think all of us here, I'm going to make an assumption, the old Mozilla principle of open by design, not by default, forces you to say, what am I trying to accomplish, right? And so if we agree, as I think we probably all do, that what you're looking for is a civil society that is empowered, inclusive, and safe, then you have to make choices you didn't have to make before.